A couple months ago now, I covered the Nakajima Rufe, more formally the A6M2N, or less formally, that time Nakajima slapped floats on a Zero. This was a uniquely Japanese solution to the issue of far-flung island bases. They would retrofit the Zero fighter with floats and station them at those bases. It would allow for aircraft at islands that lacked airfields, or alternatively, for covering amphibious assaults. In practice, of course, that wouldn't quite work out. The Japanese were well beyond their expansion phase by the time the Rufe entered service. So those aircraft were used more for defensive roles. In places like the Aleutians, where there was a distinct lack of airfields, or the Solomons, where they operated from both islands, and the tender Kamikawa Maru. It was the latter theater that is most relevant for today. The first sightings of Rufes in the Solomons, and to a lesser extent the Aleutians, captured American attention. This was late 1942 when the Essex Swarm had yet to come online. The same held true for light and escort carriers. As such, land-based aircraft were expected to be quite important. However, much like the Japanese, the United States perceived an issue: what to do when there weren't land bases to operate from. Well, one answer was to simply build an airbase. We'll be returning to that point later. The other answer, well, that was copy the Japanese. Put floats on an existing aircraft and use it to operate from forward bases. If only until more capable aircraft could arrive to take its place. Now, this wasn't something the Navy was unfamiliar with. There were experiments to this effect with the Vought Vindicator, although those went nowhere. In 1942, however, the old Vindicator was not the thought. The Rufe was. The Navy took note of the capabilities of the Japanese fighter and began to think, what if we had an aircraft like that? It was a reasonable thought, really. It wasn't at all apparent how fast carriers could be brought online, and the Marines ashore would need air cover, even if a situation came up to deny them that. Like, for example, most of the fleet carriers being taken out of action, or a lack of secure and safe airfields to operate from. As such, somewhere along the chain, this thought was put into action. A request would be sent home to attempt a modification of the Grumman Wildcat in the same vein as the Rufe, a hopefully quick and simple fix to a perceived issue. Interestingly, the development process would follow the same track as the Japanese competitor. An existing aircraft handed off to a different company to modify. With the Rufe, that was Nakajima tweaking the Mitsubishi Zero. With the Wildcat, it would be Grumman taking one of their F4 F3s and sending it off. They were tapped out developing improved Wildcats and eventually the Hellcat. So this one fighter would go off to an expert in floats, the Edo Aircraft Corporation. Or is it Edo? I'm not entirely sure. Either way, Edo would receive this fighter in October 1942, only a couple months after the Rufe was first encountered off Guadalcanal, and a sign of how much the Navy wanted this done. Though I've seen reference to the initial proposal being made in September, for what that's worth. Now, with that background done, let's look at the aircraft and what Edo did with it. The fighter they received in 1942 was, for all intents and purposes, a standard F4 F3, taken directly off the Grumman production line and sent off for modification, with what amounted to a blank check to do so. The Navy wanted results, and Edo could do whatever they felt necessary in this regard, short of course, a complete ground-up redesign. That note is important because the Navy would prefer to use as much of the base Wildcat as humanly possible. If this was to succeed, it would require that for ease of manufacture. Edo would take to the challenge with enthusiasm. The first modification they made was fairing over the wheel wells and removing the wheels. This was intended as a float plane, not an amphibian like the Catalina. So, much like the Rufe, the wheels were simply deadweight. Though I will note that the replacement floats could have small wheels fitted to help move around on land. I don't know of any plans to use those in service, but worth mentioning. In any case, once the wheels were removed, the company put 2 of their own floats on the Wildcat. Those were attached to the wings close in to the fuselage. A system of struts would be used to hold them in place. 2 large ones attached to the wing, matched by smaller struts attached to the main fuselage. Those floats were it for the Wildcat, in contrast to the Rufe, which opted instead for 1 large central float and 2 smaller wing ones for stability. Beyond this work, modifications were kept simple on the initial redesign, consisting of a pair of fins added to the tail to help with yaw stability. These were small rudders linked to the main rudder and gave the Wildcat a distinctive look. That aside, all of this work resulted in an aircraft that was only about 500 pounds, 226 kilograms, heavier than the basic F4F3. Edo had developed very light floats for this work. That was good for performance, though as we'll see, less so than might have been hoped. In any event, when the floats and fins were complete, the new plane could be tested. All of this work took into early 1943, mostly to make sure the Wildcat wouldn't fall apart on takeoff. Because of this, the Wildcatfish, as it would be nicknamed, only flew on February 28, 1943. Still a pretty fast turnaround, all things being equal, of a few months. That first flight saw a Grumman test pilot, T.F. Kurt, take the plane into the air. The Wildcatfish would lumber into the sky, where it performed adequately. Kurt would note that directional stability was still lacking, even with the modifications to the tail. To rectify that problem, Edo took their plane back in and further modified it. A large ventral fin was added to the lower tail, making it very easy to tell when a picture of the prototype was taken. If it's lacking the big protrusion on the bottom, it's an early photo. If it has it, it's a late photo. This is another thing in common with the Rufe, which was similarly fitted with a ventral fin, albeit a far smaller one. Either way, once that was fitted, testing could continue. The new fin seems to have solved the issues enough, and the Navy was showing some interest. The Wildcatfish, or XF4F3S, the S being for seaplane, was promising. It was rugged and fully capable of operating from most harbors. In fact, if the weather was calm, the plane could get airborne in 34 seconds. This was all well and good, as was the fact it could retain the 450 caliber machine guns of the base model, and more importantly, 80% parts compatibility with the basic F4F3. However, not all was sunshine and roses, even at this point. While the aircraft was fast to take off and generally stable, the floats imposed penalties. The notable drag made the already sluggish Wildcat even more sluggish. Agility suffered, and the top speed was lowered by a full 60 miles per hour, or 96 kilometers per hour, coming out to 266 miles per hour, 428 kilometers per hour, compared to 331 or 533 on the base model, making it more like 65 miles per hour less. You'll sometimes see an even slower speed, 241 miles per hour, posted online. I'll admit I'm not sure where that originates from, as I've not seen it in print sources. Regardless, that is a substantial hit to performance. Just for comparison's sake, the Rufe was around 270 miles per hour or 435 kilometers per hour. In spite of this, the Navy was impressed enough to make an initial order of 100 aircraft. Grumman would produce the planes in default F4F3 layout, but they would never be fit with floats as it would turn out. The reason being relatively simple. By the time testing wrapped up, it was mid-1943. The Navy had plenty of carriers being built, and Seabees had proven quite adept at building airfields on any suitably flat piece of land, and doing so at record speed as well. The entire reason for the Wildcatfish no longer existed. Coupled with the lacking performance, it shouldn't be surprising that the program was canceled. The existing aircraft would be given to Edo, who used it for testing into 1946, at which point this unique aircraft was scrapped and its story came to an end. Although, as a final note, the 100 F4F3s ordered from Grumman would turn out to be the final Wildcats built by their original company, before Grumman shifted to the Hellcat, and Wildcat production shifted to the General Motors models. And of those 100, several has survived to the modern day, including the sole remaining flyable F4F3 in the world. An interesting little postscript on the story of the Wildcatfish. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.